I never thought that at my age, 79, with more years behind me than ahead of me, I'd find myself sitting on a defendant's bench in a cold, sterile courtroom. And the person suing me, the one trying to throw my husband and me out of the very house we spent our whole lives building, well, that's my own daughter, the little girl I love more than life itself. My name is Sarah, and I'm telling you my story from the little coastal town of St. Augustine, Florida. This is a story about how love was twisted and turned into a weapon, about how trust was shattered into a million little pieces, and about how a complete stranger managed to poison my family from the inside out. So pull up a chair, settle in, and let me tell you how it all began, and how it all fell apart. At this stage of my life, memories can be like old photographs, the kind with yellowed, curling edges. Some of them are faded and blurry, where you can't quite make out the faces anymore. But then there are others that are so sharp, so clear, it just hurts to look at them. This story I'm about to tell you, it's one of the sharp ones. It started in a place where folks usually come to end their life stories peacefully, right here, in the seaside town of St. Augustine, Florida. I'm Sarah, 79 years old now. My husband, Michael, he's already past 81. We were never rich people, not by a long shot, but we had a full life, a life built on love and good old-fashioned hard work. And the proof of that life is this house right here. It's a cozy little cream-colored bungalow with a white picket fence wrapped around a garden that Michael has poured half his life into. That brilliant pink bougainvillea he planted when we first moved in has now crawled all over the porch roof, hanging down in big clusters like a curtain to shade us from the sun. Most mornings, you'd find me right here on this porch swing, watching Michael meticulously pruning leaves and picking off pests. The salty air from the Atlantic would drift in, carrying that sweet smell of the jasmine we planted along the walkway. This place, it's more than just a house. It's where we held each other's hands through the storms of our youth. It's where we welcomed our children home. And it's where we planned on saying our final goodbyes to this world. It's our nest, our fortress, our living diary holding everything we've ever been. You see, we weren't blessed with children of our own. For a long time, that was a silent ache in our hearts, an empty space that no amount of money or success could ever fill. And then, fate brought Daniel to us. We met him at a social services center. He was just 6 years old then, a quiet little boy with big, deep eyes that were always looking at the ground. They told us he'd been through a lot of trauma. We didn't ask too many questions. We just opened our arms. Michael spent months just sitting with Daniel in silence, teaching him how to build model airplanes, how to tell the different birds in our garden apart. Slowly, like a young sprout starved of sunlight, the boy began to open up. He never was a big talker, but his love showed in all the little things he did. A wildflower he'd picked and left on my pillow, the way he'd quietly fix a wobbly leg on Michael's favorite chair. Daniel, he was our peace. A few years later, when Daniel was about 10, another one of life's storms hit, and this time her name was Jessica. Her story was both a fairy tale and a tragedy. Early one morning, she was found, a tiny, red-faced newborn wrapped in an old towel, left in a basket on the hospital steps. No note, no name. She was a fighter, that one, clinging to life. And when we heard her story on the local news, it felt like someone had reached right into my chest and squeezed my heart. We just knew. We knew we had to be her family. Jessica was the complete opposite of Daniel. If Daniel was a still, calm lake, Jessica was a dancing flame. She was bright, bubbly, and had a smile that could melt the coldest winter frost. She filled our home with laughter, with questions that never ended, with this boundless energy. She'd wrap her little arms around Michael's neck and make him tell her stories for hours. She'd sneak up behind me and give me a hug while I was at the stove. She was our little sunshine, warming our whole family. And Daniel, with his quiet nature, always looked out for his baby sister, always loved her dearly. He would patiently sit and braid her hair or give her the biggest piece of cake. We thought our family was finally, truly perfect. We gave Jessica everything, maybe even more than we gave Daniel. It wasn't because we loved her more, but because we always felt she needed to be compensated for the rough start she had in life. We were so proud of everything she did. She was always at the top of her class, earned a scholarship to a prestigious university, and then landed a great job in finance. Michael would often pat me on the shoulder, his eyes sparkling with pride, and say, "You see that, Sarah? Our girl Jessica has the head of a CFO. Smart, sharp. We won't have to worry about a thing when we're old." Oh, the sweet innocence of old age. That very pride, that complete and total trust, would become the seed of the tragedy that was to come. As we eased into our retirement years, our health started to go downhill a bit. Michael developed a heart condition, and my arthritis got pretty bad. Keeping up with bills and paperwork started to feel like a real chore. Jessica, now a successful young woman, would visit often and help us get things in order. She started talking about things like trust funds and power of attorney, words that sounded like a foreign language to us. One evening, as we were all sitting together after dinner, Jessica brought it up. I remember that night so clearly. The warm yellow light in the living room, the sound of crickets chirping outside in the garden, and my daughter's beautiful, confident face. "Mom, Dad," she began, her voice so gentle and full of care. "I was looking over some of your paperwork. I think we should organize things a little better for the future. You know, to avoid any hassles down the road, like having to go through probate court or dealing with complicated inheritance taxes." Michael nodded along, trusting her completely. "The girl's got a point. We're getting old, getting forgetful. Whatever you think is best, honey." "There's a really simple way to handle it," Jessica continued, looking us straight in the eyes. "With this house, instead of putting it in a will, you can just transfer the title over to me now. Legally, it'll be in my name, but of course, you'll live here for the rest of your lives. This will let us bypass all that legal red tape later on. It's just a way for me to take care of you, to make sure everything is smooth and simple." I felt a flicker of hesitation. A cold little feeling ran down my spine, one of those mother's instincts you sometimes get. "But is that really okay, honey, to just sign away our biggest asset while we're still alive?" Jessica let out a soft, gentle laugh. She took my hand. "Oh, Mom, you worry too much. I'm your daughter. This house is still your house, always will be. This is just paperwork to make things easier later. You've trusted me all these years. Are you telling me now?" She let the sentence hang in the air, her eyes dropping a little. Instantly, I felt a pang of guilt. Michael quickly waved his hand. "Oh, heavens, your mother's just borrowing trouble. You're right, it's a smart idea. We trust you completely, Jessica." And just like that, we agreed. A few weeks later, Jessica took us to a notary's office. It was a cold room that smelled of new paper and the seriousness of the law. We signed a thick stack of documents without reading them closely. We just looked at our daughter's smiling face, listened as the notary explained this was a deed of transfer. Michael even made a joke as he signed his name. "Well, I guess I'm officially a tenant in my own daughter's house now." We laughed. All three of us laughed. Dear Lord, if only we had known then that her smile was no longer warm sunshine, but a cold, calculating glare. If only we had known that the pen in our hands wasn't just signing a piece of paper, but signing our own eviction notice from the life we had spent a lifetime building. With a simple stroke of a pen, we had given her not just the key to our house, but the key to our entire world. We had no idea we had also just handed her the weapon she would one day use to tear it all down. After that, things started to go downhill. Not all at once, but slowly, like a tiny crack in a wall that quietly spreads each day until the whole structure comes crumbling down. And it all started with the arrival of a man named Rick. The first few months after we signed those papers passed in a kind of false peace. Michael still tended to his garden, and I still baked the cookies the kids loved. Jessica still stopped by, but maybe if I had been paying closer attention, I would have noticed the change. She no longer sat for hours listening to her father talk about the birds. Her hugs seemed a little more rushed. But when you're old, it's sometimes just easier to believe the excuses you want to believe. She's busy. Her job is stressful. We were lying to ourselves because the truth was just too terrifying to face. And then Rick showed up. Jessica brought him home on a Sunday afternoon. He pulled up in a flashy silver sports car that looked completely out of place on our quiet street, parking it right in front of our white picket fence. Rick was tall, with slicked-back blonde hair, and he was wearing an expensive suit, even on a hot Florida afternoon. He had a big, bright smile with perfectly white teeth and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything. He brought a fancy bottle of wine and a gift basket full of exotic fruits and pastries we'd never seen before. "Hello, Sarah, Michael," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "I'm Rick. I've heard so much about you both from Jessica." Michael, ever the hospitable one, was won over instantly. "Well, hello there, son. Come on in. Jessica, you've been holding out on us, keeping such a handsome fella a secret." Rick let out a big, hearty laugh. "We wanted to be sure before we made the official introductions. I truly admire Jessica. She's smart, talented, and has such a kind heart. She must get it from you two." Throughout dinner that day, Rick was the perfect guest. He raved about my roasted chicken, saying it was better than any five-star restaurant. He marveled at Michael's old stamp collection, and he told funny stories about his work as an entrepreneur. But I just couldn't shake a feeling of unease. There was something in the way his eyes darted around the house, a look that wasn't admiration, but more like appraisal. When he looked at the old oil painting over the fireplace, I saw his eyes narrow in a calculating way. When Michael innocently mentioned that we'd paid off the house 20 years ago, Rick's smile seemed to get just a little bit wider. "You're a lucky woman, Sarah," he said to me later while I was clearing dishes in the kitchen. "Having a daughter as devoted as Jessica. These days, it's rare to find a child willing to take on the burden of a parent's property." "Oh, well, we trust her," I replied, a bit hesitantly. "Of course you do," Rick said quickly. "But being in business, I know that sometimes trust needs to be backed up by clear paperwork, just in case." That phrase stuck with me. Later that night, I said to Michael, "I don't have a good feeling about that Rick, dear." Michael, reading his newspaper, just waved it away. "Oh, Sarah, there you go again, worrying for nothing. The boy seems decent, successful. Our Jessica has good judgment. Don't be so hard on him." I fell silent. I tried to trust my daughter, to trust her choice. It was a fatal mistake. A few weeks later, the real stage was set. Jessica called, saying she and Rick were coming over to help us clean out some old papers in the attic. I was pleased, thinking how thoughtful she was. It was a trap. That evening, as I was bringing some lemonade up to them, I overheard Rick's voice coming from Michael's study, where we kept all our important documents. His tone was full of feigned surprise and concern. "Jessica, honey, you have to come see this. I just happened to see the file for the house. Did you know there's no life estate clause in this deed transfer? Nothing that legally guarantees your parents the right to live here for life?" I froze just outside the door. Jessica's voice sounded uncertain. I'm not sure. My lawyer said it was a standard form." "Standard for who?" Rick's voice turned serious. "Standard for you, maybe. Legally speaking, right now, this house is 100% yours. Your parents have zero legal standing here. My God, if something happened to you or if you got into debt, creditors could come in and kick them out at a moment's notice. Do you understand how risky that is? Why on earth would they put themselves in such a vulnerable position? There was a silence. I could just picture my daughter's confused face. Rick had planted the first seed of doubt, not by attacking us, but by posing as a protector, as someone worried for our safety. It was a perfect performance. From that day on, things changed fast. Jessica visited less. The phone calls became fewer and farther between. When she was here, Rick was always by her side, like a shadow. He never let her be alone with us for more than 5 minutes. And then the poison started to seep in, little by little. It was only later, piecing together the painful fragments, that I could imagine what was said in their private conversations. Rick must have said things like, "Look, your parents gave Daniel money to start his business, to build his own future. What did they give you? An old house that comes with the responsibility of caring for 2 elderly people? They put it in your name, so you'd be on the hook for property taxes and repairs. It's a clever way to burden you." Or maybe things like, "Don't you ever feel like you're just the backup plan, Jessica? Daniel was the one they had real hopes for. You were their retirement plan. You deserve so much more than that. We deserve our own life, a fresh start." It wasn't just words. He began to create tiny fractures in Jessica's relationship with Daniel. I remember Daniel's birthday that year like it was yesterday. Jessica had spent a whole afternoon picking out an antique watch she knew her brother would love. She wrote a long, heartfelt card filled with childhood memories. I saw the joy in her eyes as she wrapped it. Rick was so enthusiastic. "Let me mail it for you," he said. "I'm heading right past the post office. You just relax." A week went by, then 2. Daniel never called to say thank you. I could see the disappointment on Jessica's face. She kept looking at her phone, her expression falling. Then one day, Rick found the package under the seat of his sports car. "Oh my God, honey, I am so sorry," he said, his face a mask of regret. "The post office called me a couple days ago saying the recipient refused the package, so they sent it back. I've been so swamped with work, I completely forgot to tell you. My mind is a sieve." He held Jessica, comforting her, and then, when she had calmed down, he whispered a sentence just loud enough for me to overhear, but sharp enough to pierce my heart. "See, Daniel didn't even notice you hadn't sent a gift. Maybe, in his heart, you just aren't that important to him." The poison didn't stop there. He started targeting Michael. Michael had a small wooden statue, a gift from an old army buddy that he cherished. One day, it was broken, lying in pieces on the floor. Rick was the first to discover it. "I'm so sorry, Michael," he said. "I must have knocked it over while I was tidying up. I'm so clumsy." But later, I heard him in the kitchen with Jessica. "Your parents only remember things about Daniel. They don't pay attention to anything that matters to you. Look, a priceless keepsake of your father's, and they didn't even notice it was broken until I pointed it out. They're just not all there anymore, Jessica." Once he'd sown enough doubt and resentment, Rick moved on to his grand finale, the financial setup. With his credentials as a businessman and the experience of a con artist, he offered to help Jessica review our savings and investments. He spread charts and papers all over the dining room table, using terms that went right over our heads. "Michael's investment in this fund is far too risky," he'd say in an expert tone, pointing to a column of red numbers he'd probably drawn himself. "One little dip in the stock market and you too could lose your entire life savings. You're too old to be taking these kinds of risks." He'd look at Jessica with an expression of grave responsibility. "You're the one with the financial background. You have to step up and protect them, protect the family's assets. Honestly, the safest thing to do right now is to move major assets like this house completely out of their portfolio. By having it solely in your name, we shield it from any legal or market risks. It's the only prudent thing to do." He had transformed the act of stealing our home from a simple act of greed into a noble act of salvation in Jessica's eyes. And my daughter, manipulated by fear and flattered by her role as protector, bought his performance hook, line, and sinker. His whispers grew more and more venomous. One evening, Michael was on the phone with Daniel, laughing and congratulating him on a recent success at work. After he hung up, he couldn't stop singing his son's praises. Rick waited until Michael had left the room, then turned to Jessica, who was sitting there silently. "Honey, don't you see it? Every time Daniel visits, or even just calls, this house becomes a shrine to him. And you're treated more like the high-class help. They love your usefulness, Jessica, not you." Jessica, the daughter we had raised with every ounce of our love, had been completely brainwashed. Perhaps she already had her own insecurities, the feelings of an abandoned child who always fears they aren't quite good enough, not truly loved. Rick had found those cracks and pried them wide open, pouring in the poison of greed and selfishness. That first hairline crack had become a chasm. The final warning came in the form of a letter. One afternoon, the mailman delivered a thick envelope with the seal of a law firm we didn't recognize. Michael opened it. His hands began to shake. His face went as white as a sheet. What is this, Sarah?" he stammered, handing the letter to me. I put on my reading glasses, and the words swam before my eyes. Complaint for eviction. Demand for possession of property. Plaintiff, Miss Jessica Peterson. Defendants, Mr. Michael Peterson and Mrs. Sarah Peterson. My world shattered. I scrambled to call Jessica. The phone rang and rang, then went to voicemail. I called again. This time, she answered. "Hello?" Her voice was cold, unfamiliar. "Jessica, honey, what's going on? We just got a letter from a lawyer." My own voice broke. "I know," she said flatly. "Everything will proceed as stated in the letter. Don't call me again. My lawyer will be in contact with you." "But why? Jessica, why are you doing this to us?" I was sobbing now. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could hear Rick whispering something in the background. Then, Jessica's voice came back, devoid of all emotion, as if she were reading from a script. "This is what needs to be done for my future. You'll understand eventually." And then she hung up. The dial tone buzzed in my ear like a hammer, driving the nails into the coffin of our lives. Michael slumped into his chair, his head in his hands. I just stood there, the letter trembling in my hand, feeling the very foundations of the home we'd spent a lifetime building shake and crumble beneath my feet. The storm had finally hit. The days that followed were a living nightmare. We existed in a fog of disbelief and horror. Michael barely spoke a word. He would sit for hours on the porch swing, but he wasn't looking at his flowers anymore. His gaze was fixed on some distant point, a place where his faith in the world had completely collapsed. I tried calling Jessica dozens of times, but it was no use. She had blocked our number. Daniel drove through the night from the city as soon as he heard. The moment I saw my son, the tears I'd been holding back finally came. Daniel didn't say much, but he wrapped his arms around both of us in a hug so strong and steady, it felt like the only solid thing left in the world. He immediately called a lawyer, an old family friend, and began to shoulder the fight that we no longer had the strength to face. "Why would she do this?" Michael finally said, his voice a raw whisper. "What did we do wrong, Sarah? What did we ever do to make her treat us like this?" I had no answer. We went over every memory, searching for a mistake, a sign we might have missed, but all we found was love. Had we simply loved her too much, trusted her too blindly? The day we went to court was gray and overcast, the clouds hanging low over St. Augustine as if the heavens themselves were mourning for us. Daniel had to support me as I walked. My knees were shaking so badly I could barely stand. Michael wore his oldest suit, the one he only wore for the most important occasions. He looked so small and lost in the cold, crowded courthouse hallway. And then we saw her, Jessica. She was standing on the other side of the hall, next to Rick. She was wearing a charcoal gray business suit, her hair pulled back in a tight, neat bun. Her face was perfectly made up, a mask that hid any and all emotion. But it was her eyes that truly killed me. Those eyes, which had once sparkled with delight on Christmas morning, were now empty and cold. She saw us. Our eyes met for just a second. I searched her face for something, anything familiar, a flicker of regret, a moment of hesitation. There was nothing. She turned her head away, coolly, as if we were complete strangers. Inside that courtroom, you could hardly breathe. Everything was dark wood, solemn and cold. We sat at the defendant's table with our lawyer, Mr. Howard, an old family friend with silver hair and kind eyes. On the other side, Jessica sat with Rick and a sharp, young lawyer with a face like ice. The hearing began. Our lawyer, Mr. Howard, tried to tell our story with all the sincerity in his heart. He spoke of how we had longed for children, about the overwhelming joy when first Daniel and then Jessica came into our lives. He spoke of unconditional love, of sacrifice, and of the absolute trust we had placed in our daughter. "Your Honor," Mr. Howard said, his voice echoing in that formal room, "this was never a real estate transaction. This was an act of love and trust from parents to a child. My clients, Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, spent their entire lives building this home. It was never their intention to give it up." I looked over at Jessica, hoping those words might reach some small corner of her heart, but she just sat there, still as a statue, staring straight ahead. And then it was their turn. That young lawyer Rick had hired stood up. He didn't just present a case. He launched a brutal attack on our very character, on our love. "Love, sacrifice," he began, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Those are beautiful words, but let's look at the reality of the situation, shall we, Your Honor?" He paced in front of the judge's bench, then turned and pointed a finger right at us. "Let's re-examine this adoption story. Did Mr. and Mrs. Peterson adopt my client, an abandoned newborn, purely out of the goodness of their hearts? Or did they need an insurance policy for their old age? They burdened her with a debt of gratitude from the time she was a child. Everything she had, they reminded her, was thanks to them. And now, when she wants a life of her own, to build her own family, they use love as chains to bind her." I felt the blood run cold in my veins. Michael squeezed my hand, his whole body trembling with rage. Daniel, sitting beside us, clenched his jaw so tight I could see the muscle jump. The lawyer continued, his voice growing sharper. "This house wasn't a gift, Your Honor. For my client, it was more like a payment for her freedom. After that character assassination, he moved in for the kill. He placed a neatly bound set of documents on the judge's desk. And now, he said, his voice like ice, let's put emotion aside and talk about facts. This is a legally executed and notarized deed of ownership signed by all three parties. It's right there in black and white, Your Honor. This house legally belongs entirely to my client, Miss Jessica Peterson, which means Mr. and Mrs. Peterson are currently residing on my client's property, illegally." The judge, an older man with a stern face, looked over the papers and then at us with a pained expression. He turned to Jessica. "Miss Peterson, the court has heard the arguments from both sides. Please state for the record what your request is." The courtroom fell silent. I saw Rick, the creature sitting next to my daughter, lean back slightly in his chair, a nearly invisible smirk of triumph on his face. He placed a hand on Jessica's back, a gesture that looked like comfort, but felt like control. Jessica didn't raise her head. She stared at her own hands, clasped so tightly on the table that her knuckles were white. She cleared her throat, and when she spoke, her voice was flat, without a single drop of emotion, as if she were reading from a script. "Your Honor," she began, "it is my property. I have been allowing them to stay as a courtesy, but now my circumstances have changed. I have plans for my future, and I need to sell the house. Michael just couldn't take it anymore. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Allowing us? Circumstances have changed? His voice broke with rage and disbelief. Our entire lives, our savings, went into that house. Jessica, what are you talking about? Objection, Jessica's lawyer shouted. Order in the court, the judge banged his gavel. He looked at Michael with something like sympathy. Mr. Peterson, I understand your frustration, sir, but you must remain calm. Legally, the paperwork speaks for itself. Michael collapsed back into his seat, shaking with a helpless rage. All our reasons, all our love, it meant nothing against a single piece of paper. The judge turned back to Jessica. So, what is your final request, Miss Peterson? Jessica kept her head bowed. She took a deep breath. My only request, she said, her voice cold and final, is that the court order Mr. and Mrs. Peterson to vacate the premises so that I may proceed with the sale. Every single word was like a poison-tipped dagger, stabbing me right in the heart. He had turned our fairy tale into a filthy accusation. He had turned our love into a selfish calculation. And my daughter, she had gone along with it. In that moment, a sharp, crushing pain seized my chest. I couldn't breathe, and the room started to spin. I heard Michael call my name in a panic, heard Daniel yell, "Mom!" The last thing I saw was Jessica's face changing, just for a second, a flicker of what looked like fear. She instinctively started to rise from her chair. But then I saw something even crueler. Rick's arm shot out and clamped down on her wrist, holding her in her seat. I saw him lean in and whisper something in her ear, something Daniel later told me a person sitting nearby overheard. Let them be. It's just an old person's trick. If you go soft now, you lose. And Jessica, my daughter, sat back down. She stayed in her seat while her mother collapsed onto the cold courthouse floor. That stillness, it killed what was left of my heart. And then, everything went black. When I came to, I was in a stark white room that smelled of antiseptic. The hospital. The old doctor, his eyes full of pity, spoke privately with Michael and Daniel. He said this heart attack was a serious warning. My heart was weak, and any more stress or shock could have devastating consequences. The best thing for her right now, he'd said, is to be in a familiar, quiet, and stable environment. A change of residence at this time would be extremely dangerous. I just lay there, staring at the white ceiling, feeling an emptiness so vast it felt like it could swallow the world. The house was gone, but worse, so much worse, we had lost our child. The little flame that once warmed our family had become a wildfire that had burned it all to the ground. The storm had passed, leaving nothing but devastation in its wake. "You're awake, Sarah," Michael whispered, his voice hoarse. "The doctor said you had a mild heart attack from the stress." I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The court hearing, Michael? What happened?" Daniel stepped closer and sat on the edge of my bed. He was quiet for a long moment, then said gently, "Mom, don't you worry about that now. You need to rest." "No," I insisted, trying to sit up. "Tell me, Daniel, what was the verdict?" Daniel looked away, clenching his hands together. "The law sided with the paperwork, Mom. The judge, he didn't have a choice. They issued the ruling. Eviction. Eviction." The word echoed in the quiet hospital room like a gunshot. Evicted from our own home. Evicted from our own life. Thrown out onto the street by the very daughter I loved more than life itself. I didn't cry. I think maybe I was all out of tears. I just lay there, staring at that blank ceiling, feeling that bottomless emptiness. The house was gone. But what was worse, so much worse, was that we had lost a child. The little flame that used to warm our family had turned into a blaze that scorched everything. And in that pile of ash, I didn't know if we could ever find anything worth saving again. The storm had passed, leaving absolute ruin behind. I stayed in the hospital for a few more days, not because my body needed it, but because I think my soul did. Those 4 sterile white walls felt like a temporary shelter, a pause between me and the brutal reality waiting outside. In there, I didn't have to face the familiar corners of our home, the keepsakes filled with memories of a daughter who was no longer mine. Michael and Daniel took turns staying with me. Michael would sit quietly, holding my hand for hours. We didn't say much. Some pain is too deep for words. It can only be shared through a hand held tight, through the understanding silence between 2 people who have walked nearly a whole lifetime together. Daniel, though, was different. He wasn't silent. In his stillness, I could feel a storm raging. He paced the room, his eyes narrowed, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was constantly on the phone, his voice low, clipped, and full of a tense energy. He wasn't my quiet, gentle boy anymore. The pain had turned him into a warrior. He was fighting, not just for the house, but for our dignity, for our peace in our final years. The day I was discharged was the day we received the official notice from the court, a cold piece of paper, setting the date we had to be out, 30 days. 30 days to pack up a lifetime. 30 days to say goodbye to everything. Walking through the door of our own home felt different this time. It wasn't that feeling of peaceful return. I felt like a trespasser. Every object seemed to look at us with pity. Michael's armchair, with the indent still perfectly shaped to his body. The wall of photographs of the children when they were small. Daniel with a missing front tooth, Jessica with pigtails and a radiant smile. I reached out and touched the photo of Jessica. The little girl in the picture was smiling at me, a smile so pure, without a hint of calculation. My God, where did that little girl go? In the days that followed, Daniel turned Michael's old study into a command center. He brought his laptop, and the sound of his furious typing filled the house late into the night. The bluish glow from the screen lit up his focused face. I brought him a glass of warm milk, standing in the doorway and watching him. The screen was filled with websites, columns of figures, old news articles. "What are you doing, Daniel?" I asked softly. He jumped, startled, and turned to me. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. "It's nothing, Mom. You should get some rest." "You're looking into Rick, aren't you?" His silence was my answer. I walked into the room and set the milk on his desk. "Be careful, son," I whispered. "I don't want anything else to happen." Daniel looked up at me, and for the first time in days, I saw a steely resolve in his eyes. "Don't worry, Mom. I will be." One morning, Daniel discovered the window of his old pickup truck had been smashed with a brick. Taped to the brick was a scrap of paper with a scrawled message, "Stay out of other people's business." That evening, as I was trying to sip some soup, the house phone rang. I answered it. A strange man's voice, cold as ice, was on the other end. "Is this Sarah? You've got a very devoted son. It would be a shame if something bad happened to him. And you should take care of your health, too. Another shock might not be so good for you." He hung up. Daniel was standing right there. He'd heard everything on speaker. I saw the fear and conflict in my son's eyes. He was facing a terrible choice. Keep investigating to save us, but possibly put me, his ailing mother, in danger. Or stop and accept losing everything. I took his hand, my own trembling. "Son, I believe in you. Save our family." Daniel looked at me, and I saw a determination in his eyes that overpowered the fear. "I'm not going to let him destroy this family without a fight, Mom. I don't believe Jessica did this on her own. It has to be him." About a week later, one evening, Daniel called us into the living room. His face was tense, but there was also a glimmer of relief, like someone who has finally found a way out of a dark tunnel. He put his laptop on the coffee table and turned the screen towards us. "Mom, Dad, I found some things," he said, his voice serious. "About Rick. His name isn't really Rick Taylor, not entirely. He's used a few others, and this is why." He clicked the mouse. A series of public records filled the screen. Bankruptcy filings for shell companies, civil lawsuits for small-scale investment fraud, massive credit card debts under different names in different states. "He's not a businessman," Daniel continued, his voice steady. "He's a professional con artist. He targets women with assets or access to assets, uses his charm to gain their trust, and then bleeds them dry. This is a list of his gambling debts in Las Vegas and Atlantic City. It's almost $500,000. He's desperate. He needs a big score, and he needs it now." Michael and I were speechless. All the disconnected pieces started to snap into place. The flashy car, the flattering words, the unusual interest in our property records. It was all part of a calculated plan. Jessica wasn't the mastermind. She was just a pawn, a tool in the hands of a master manipulator. The pain I felt didn't lessen, but it was now mixed with a new flavor, anger, and a deep, sorrowful pity for my daughter's naivety. "But what do we do now?" Michael asked, his voice shaking. "Take this to court? They'll say it's his past, that it has nothing to do with this case." "Exactly," Daniel nodded. "This isn't enough on its own. I need a confession from his own mouth." That's when Daniel told us his plan. It was bold, and it was risky. Through a friend in real estate, Daniel arranged a meeting with Rick, posing as a representative for an anonymous investor who was interested in buying our house quickly for a good price. The bait was Rick's own insatiable greed. The day Daniel put his plan into motion, I felt like I was sitting on pins and needles. It was nearly evening when he finally came home. The moment he walked through the door, we knew. His face was pale, but his eyes were burning with intensity. He didn't say a word. He just held up a black fountain pen. "I recorded everything," he said, his voice cracking with a mix of tension and relief. We gathered around the coffee table. Daniel connected the pens with his laptop. A suffocating silence filled the room as he clicked play. Rick's voice filled the air, smug and boastful. "And that's the beauty of it, my friend. It's all legal. The paperwork is clean. My girlfriend, she's a little soft, but she does what she's told. All I had to do was feed her a few lines about securing our future, about how her parents would be better cared for in a nice facility, and she bought it." I clapped a hand over my mouth to stifle a sob. Another voice, Daniel's disguised voice, asked, "But doesn't she feel guilty about her parents?" Rick's laugh echoed, a disgusting, slimy sound. "Guilty? That little fool. She's not so innocent herself." Rick's voice dripped with contempt and victory. My heart seized. Michael and I looked at each other, confused. "Before she met me, she got herself into online gambling, racked up a pretty penny in debt," Rick continued, his words twisting the knife in our wounds. "I helped her out, paid it off for her. From that moment on, I had her right in the palm of my hand. I told her either she plays along and gets the house to pay back our debt, or her little secret gets out to her holier-than-thou parents. She was scared to death. She's not just my puppet, my friend. She's a blackmailed accomplice." It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. Michael's jaw hung open. He couldn't form words. Daniel sat frozen, his face a mask of shock and fury. This twist was even more painful than the truth about Rick. Jessica, our little girl, wasn't just a naive victim who'd been manipulated. She had secrets. She had her own failings. Her actions weren't born just from misplaced trust, but from selfishness and the fear of being exposed. She was both a victim and a perpetrator. The truth was a complex, heartbreaking mess. When the recording ended, only the quiet hum of the laptop remained. The truth was laid bare, uglier and more raw than we ever could have imagined. It didn't make the hurt go away, but it gave us something we had lost, a weapon. Daniel looked at us, his eyes burning with a fierce light. "Now," he said, "now we can fight." I looked at Michael, then back at Daniel. The paralyzing despair was gone, replaced by something else, a cold resolve. This house wasn't just brick and mortar. It was our honor, our love, and we weren't going to let a stranger, a devil in a handsome suit, steal it and destroy our family. We didn't let Daniel waste a moment after getting that recording. He immediately went to work with Mr. Howard, our lawyer. With a look of renewed hope and determination, Mr. Howard submitted the tape as new evidence, petitioning the court to reconsider the verdict. But it wasn't that simple. The wheels of justice turned slowly and rigidly. The judgment had been made, and our deadline to leave the house was just days away. Daniel decided he had to force a confrontation. He called Jessica, not as a brother, but as someone who now held undeniable proof. She reluctantly agreed to meet, maybe out of curiosity, maybe because Rick had already started to fade from her life. They met at a small coffee shop downtown, not at our home, a place I knew Jessica wouldn't dare face. Daniel secretly had his phone recording, just in case, though a small part of him still hoped she would come to her senses on her own. "What is it, Daniel?" Jessica's voice was cold, distant. "I don't have much time. I know what you're going to say, but it's no use. The ruling has been made." Daniel placed a small digital recorder on the table. "Want to hear something, Jessica? A few choice words from your beloved fiancé about you, about Mom and Dad." The color drained from Jessica's face. She tried to remain composed, but her eyes began to shift nervously. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that Rick is a con artist who preys on women with money, and you were just the next pawn in his game," Daniel said bluntly. "I'm talking about this recording, where he brags about how he manipulated you, how he poisoned your mind against us. He calls you that little fool, Jessica. That little fool believes everything I say." Daniel pressed play. As the recording played, Jessica's face was a storm of changing emotions. The defiance melted away, replaced by shock as she heard Rick's sweet words exposed as a dirty scheme. And then, when she heard the man she loved call her that little fool, a choked sob escaped her throat. The tough mask she had worn for so long shattered, revealing a deep, raw wound. She buried her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking. But when the secret of her own gambling debt was revealed, her collapse turned into pure panic. Jessica shot up, her eyes wide with terror. Her breathing became ragged. "No, no, how did he know?" she stammered, her face as white as a ghost. Her biggest, dirtiest secret, the shame she had buried for so long, was now cruelly exposed. Daniel looked directly into his sister's panicked eyes. The anger in his heart was now mixed with a painful pity. He didn't shout. He just spoke, his voice low and heavy, as if each word was a stone. "A gambling debt? Jessica, is that all this was about?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "For a debt, you were willing to destroy this entire family?" Jessica could only shake her head numbly, tears streaming down her face. Daniel leaned forward, his voice now a pained cross-examination. "Why? Why didn't you tell Mom and Dad? Why didn't you tell me? Have we ever once turned our backs on you, Jessica? Was there ever a time we refused to help you? We're not rich, but we would have sold everything we own to protect you. You know that." He paused, looking deep into his sister's brokenness. Or, Daniel's voice grew quieter, probing at the insecurity he knew had always lived inside her. Or, is it that after all these years, you still think you don't belong? That you're an outsider? That you have to hide your mistakes because you're afraid of being judged? You chose to trust a stranger you just met, A man who only spoke sweet words instead of the people who have loved you unconditionally for nearly 30 years. Why, Jessica? Daniel's questions were sharper than Rick's confession. They didn't just expose her actions, they exposed her soul. Jessica couldn't answer. She could only weep, a cry of belated regret and profound self-loathing. Just then, the coffee shop door flew open violently. Rick stormed in, followed by two rough-looking men. He hadn't fled. He'd been watching Daniel. His handsome face was gone, replaced by a mask of crimson rage, his eyes wild like a cornered animal. "Give that back to me," he roared, lunging for the recorder pen. Daniel, though smaller, bravely stood up to shield the cowering Jessica. "You're not getting it, you bastard." "You think you're so smart?" Rick screamed, shoving the table over with a crash of breaking cups. "I'm getting that house, and I'm going to make your sister pay for not listening to me. You have no idea how much she owes me." A brawl erupted. Rick and his goons went after Daniel. Jessica let out a terrified shriek, trapped between the brother trying to protect her and the devil she once loved. Thankfully, the cafe owner had the presence of mind to hit the silent alarm. The piercing wail of police sirens grew louder in the distance. Hearing them, Rick cursed, quickly signaling his men. He shot Daniel a look of pure hatred, then glanced at a trembling Jessica with one last threatening glare before scrambling out the back door. The siren screamed, and Rick and his thugs were gone, but his true face had been completely unmasked before Jessica's very eyes. The coffee shop was a mess. Chairs overturned, glass crunching underfoot. Daniel, though he had a few bruises on his face, was still standing. He was breathing heavily, watching the back door where Rick had vanished. Then he turned to his sister. Jessica was still huddled on the floor amidst the wreckage, as if her own world had just been shattered to pieces. Daniel slowly walked over, bent down and held out his hand. "Get up, Jessica." She looked up at her brother, her red-rimmed eyes filled with fear, shame, and a bottomless despair. She was no longer the cold woman from the courtroom, nor Rick's naive prey. Now she was just a lost child who realized she had destroyed everything. She took Daniel's hand and shakily got to her feet. What do I do now?" Her voice broke into a whisper. "What do I do, Daniel? I want to drop the lawsuit. I'll tell the lawyer. I'll tell the court I was wrong." Daniel looked at his sister, his expression a complicated mix of anger, pity, and the deep sorrow of a brother. "It's too late for that, Jessica," he said, his voice low. "The judgment has been made. The eviction order is signed. Legally, it's over." Daniel's words were like a final hammer blow, shattering the last bit of fragile hope left in Jessica. "No," she mumbled, then collapsed against her brother's chest, sobbing uncontrollably. Her cries were no longer just of regret, but of absolute helplessness. She had closed every door herself, had pushed her family and herself into a dead end. "I ruined everything. I ruined it all," she repeated between sobs. Daniel stood still, letting his sister cry. He didn't hug her back, but he raised one hand and patted her lightly on the back. It was a conflicted gesture. The comfort of a brother for his broken sister, but also the distance of a son who was shouldering the pain of his entire family. "I have to get back to Mom and Dad," he said after a long moment, his voice growing distant. He gently detached himself from her. "As for you," he looked her straight in the eye. "You sit here and you think. You think about everything. About the debt, about Rick, and about what you did to the people who love you most." With that, Daniel turned and walked away, leaving Jessica alone in the chaos of the coffee shop and the ruins of her own soul. His straight but weary back disappeared through the door, leaving behind a vast emptiness and the agonizing question of a future that had no clear path. In the days that followed, our story, This heartbreaking tale of the old couple being sued by their adopted daughter was picked up by the local newspapers. Especially after Daniel released the evidence about Rick, the story spread like wildfire on social media and larger news channels. People all over Florida, our neighbors, people who had never met us, expressed their outrage. They sent thousands of letters and emails, and they flooded the governor's office with phone calls. But finally, a day of the eviction arrived. A sheriff's car pulled up in front of our house. The law had to be enforced. They were here to remove us from our home. What they didn't expect, however, was to find dozens of our neighbors, friends, and even complete strangers standing in a silent human chain in front of our gate. They held hands, carrying hand-painted signs. Justice for the Petersons. St. Augustine is their home. Mrs. Henderson from next door, a woman nearly 90 years old, stood right at the front, leaning on her cane and staring down the sheriff. "You'll have to go through me first, young man," she said, her voice trembling but firm. A few local news reporters were there, their cameras rolling. The image of a small community standing up to protect a vulnerable old couple was broadcast live. It created a wave of indignation that reached all the way to the governor's office. It was the power of the community, of human decency, that forced the hand of the government. Governor David Marshall, a man known for being decisive and compassionate, was listening. He called an emergency meeting with his legal advisors. That afternoon, as I sat numbly on the porch swing, watching Michael pack up small items from the garden, the phone rang. It was Daniel. "Mom, listen to this." His voice was electric with excitement and overwhelming relief. The governor's office just made an official announcement. He's decided to intervene. He's issued an executive order to stay the eviction indefinitely. I shot to my feet, nearly dropping the phone. "Really, Daniel? Are you sure?" "I'm positive, Mom. I just saw it on the news. The governor said that on his watch, no one will be evicted from their home because of a legal loophole created by deceit and greed. He said that people must be treated with dignity and compassion." Tears streamed down my face. Not tears of sorrow, but tears of relief, of a hope I thought was lost forever. Michael heard it too. He dropped the small trowel he was holding and turned to look at me, his old eyes glistening with disbelief. We threw our arms around each other, a tight embrace filled with tears and choked sobs. Our house was saved. Our home would not be taken from us. Rick was finally arrested a few days later trying to flee the state. The police recovered the recorder pen that Daniel had tossed in a nearby trash can, and it became the ironclad evidence against him. A few days after the eviction order was officially rescinded, Jessica appeared at our front door. She just stood there, her eyes swollen and red, her face pale and gaunt. The polished exterior was gone, the false confidence was gone. All that was left was a lost, remorseful child. I opened the door. We stood looking at each other in silence. I didn't know what to say. All the words, anger, blame, love, seemed too small for what had happened. "Mom, Dad," she began, her voice raw from crying. Fresh tears welled up and spilled down her cheeks. I'm so sorry. I did a terrible thing. I was so stupid. I don't know what to say. I just know I destroyed everything." Michael came to the door. His face was still etched with weariness and pain. He didn't say a word, but he reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. A light touch, but it held all the forgiveness he could muster at that moment. I looked at my daughter. A mother's heart, no matter how deeply wounded, can never stop loving. I remembered her as a baby, fitting perfectly in my arms, trusting me completely. I remembered the sound of her bright, bubbly laughter. This girl, despite the unspeakable pain she had caused, was still my Jessica. "Come inside, Jessica," I said, my own voice trembling. "Come on in the house." Jessica broke down completely, a wrenching sob that seemed to pour out all the pain, regret, and shame she had been carrying. She hugged me, then Michael, and finally Daniel, who was standing quietly behind us. It was a tear-soaked reunion, an imperfect reconciliation, but it was a beginning. But forgiveness is not easy. The wounds are still there. One evening, a few weeks later, when I suggested we needed to give Jessica time to make things right, Michael shook his head, his gaze lost somewhere in the garden outside. "You can forgive her, Sarah. You're her mother," he said, his voice hoarse. "But me, I can't forget the sight of you collapsing on that cold courthouse floor. I can't forget how she sat there when that man held her back. This wound," he placed a hand over his chest where his tired heart was beating, "it's going to stay right here forever." Our house was saved. After everything, Daniel decided to transfer his job and move back home for good. He said he wanted to be close to take care of us, but I know he also wanted to stand guard to make sure the fortress he had rebuilt would never fall again. Suddenly, our house felt like it did in the old days, with both our children under one roof. Laughter returned, but it was only between the three of us. Jessica stayed. She wasn't a successful financial professional anymore. She had lost everything. She found a part-time job at the local library. Her life now is a series of quiet, penitent acts. She gets up before everyone else, makes Michael's coffee exactly the way he likes it, then goes out to silently tend the garden beds she once ignored. Every afternoon, she's out there alone, watering Michael's prized roses. In the evenings, she cooks the meals we all love, then eats in silence, rarely looking up. She is no longer the bright, dancing flame she once was. Now she is more like a shadow, moving quietly through the very home she tried to take away. Michael and Daniel, while they accept her presence, still maintain an invisible distance. They rarely speak to her directly unless absolutely necessary. But time, like water on a stone, slowly begins to wear down even the hardest edges. One day, Michael threw his back out trying to lift a heavy planter. Without a word, Jessica ran out, took the pot from his hands, and gently set it down. She then came back with liniment and quietly began to rub his sore back. Michael didn't push her away. He just sat there with his eyes closed. I don't know what he was thinking, but when he opened them, the look he gave Jessica was a little less cold. It was the same with Daniel. He hasn't completely forgiven her, but he's starting to see the change in his sister is real. One night, while Daniel was struggling with his old computer, Jessica brought him a cup of tea. You need a new hard drive for that," she mumbled, pointing at the screen. It was the first time in months she had initiated a conversation with him that wasn't a reply to a question. Daniel looked up, surprised, then gave a small nod. "Thanks." A simple word, but in this house, it carried a tremendous weight. The wounds are still there. The painful memories can't be erased. Every time I look at Jessica, I still feel a pang of that hurt. Our family is not what it once was. The absolute trust is broken, and maybe it will never be fully whole again. But at least we are trying. We are learning to forgive, not to forget the pain, but to be able to live with it, to keep the bitterness from eating us alive. And Daniel, my strong, devoted son, remains the steady pillar of this family. He never stopped loving and protecting us. He accepts Jessica's presence, and I know that is a huge step, a grace that only someone with a truly good heart can offer. And that, my friends, is the story of my family, a story of love, betrayal, and the fragile hope of healing.